I'm pleased to officially welcome you now to today's webinar. This webinar is intended to reach out to an audience on the internet later. So a little side note for this future internet audience is this is a RELOCAL project webinar series entitled Resituating the Local in Cohesion and Territorial Development. It is an Horizon 2020 project, and it is coming to an end now. We already have hosted 2 webinars discussing policy considerations based on our findings from the last 4.5 years. And today we will host a 3rd webinar entitled Top-down versus Bottom-up Approaches in Promoting Place-Based and Participative Action in the series. So we will take a closer look into the methodology and also of the perceptions of these place-based actions. May I ask all participants to check if you are unmuted? Yeah, we have problems that the meeting overview sometimes is in German for some people. So I hope you can cope anyway with finding the unmute button. It's down in the left bottom. There you can see Stummschalten or mute or unmute or Stummschalten, Lautschalten. So in the next 2 hours, we would like to approach this problem of from different angles. So first, Professor Michael Woods from our partner project Imagine will give us insights on how they tackle this issue. And then we will listen to RELOCAL researchers who will present their studies from a deliberate top-down or bottom-up angle, which may seem a bit artificial at first, but this is how we labeled the studies first, and this also helps us to formulate questions of what is perceived of injustice from local stakeholders' view and from of nationally driven initiatives. The Romanian team will conclude this researcher session by already re-evaluating this approach with its limits and pitfalls based on their experience from Romanian cases. So we would like to collect your remarks in the chat for the final discussion, but also this discussion is quite tight. So please bear in mind, we would like here to focus on a very practical angle from a viewpoint of formulating concrete policy recommendations based on such studies. So for this we have support. I try to find him here in the participants list. We are happy to welcome Paul Soto, Senior Policy Expert from European Network for Rural Development, based in Brussels. So he will pick up your messages he would find most interesting for his work. From an organizational point of view, I have to point out that this is a webinar, so it is recorded. It is recorded right now and will also be published later on the website or on YouTube. So if you do not agree to that, you have to switch out the camera and microphone and rename your avatar. But please don't do that, please, because we want to have a lively discussion and lots of friendly faces here. Yeah, so I'm a member of the Luxembourg team from RELOCAL, and most of you already know Berthe. And she has the pleasure now to introduce our first guest, Michael Woods, from our partner project, who will give you a short but nevertheless very interesting keynote to start this webinar.
Thank you, Juliana. So also a warm welcome from my side to the 3rd webinar of RELOCAL. I'd like to welcome Professor Michael Woods. Thank you very much for agreeing on a very short note basis to give a keynote today and to present our twin project, Imagine. So both projects, RELOCAL and Imagine, were financed through the same call of Horizon 2020. Mike's research interest is especially on rural geography and political geography. He is working at the Aberystwyth University in Wales, and he is also the co-director of the Center for World Politics and Society. I know Mike for a very long time because we have been in a FP7 project, well, by now nearly 10 years ago. So his current and recent research falls primarily into the research of territorial inequalities and spatial justice, global countryside and the reconstitution of the rural places, civil society, community governance, and the social and economic restructuring of rural communities and regions. So this fits very perfectly also with what we want to discuss today, the top-down and bottom-up approaches. And so, Mike, the floor is yours, and thanks again for taking over this important task.
Thank you very much, Bertha, and thank you, Julianne, as well, for organising this webinar and inviting me to speak. I'm hopefully going to share my screen, so let's hope this works now. Can you just confirm that you can see that? Brilliant. Thank you, Julianne. So as Bertha said, I'm involved in the Imagine project, which is a partner project to RELOCAL. So I'm going to be primarily speaking about some of the work we've done as part of Imagine and the findings from that, but in a way which I hope will provide some context and set up the very interesting case studies from RELOCAL, which we're going to be hearing about this afternoon. As Bertha mentioned, both RELOCAL and Imagine, along with a third, Project Cosmo, were funded via Horizon 2020 call on spatial justice, social cohesion, and territorial inequalities. And I've just picked out a few phrases here from the call text about what we were being asked to look at, exploring the links and tensions between territorial cohesion, sustainable development, and spatial justice in Europe at a time of crisis, the relationship between the use of potentials of distinctive spatial resources on the one hand, and equality, equal opportunities, and justice on the other, and contributing to identifying policies promoting spatial justice and socioeconomic well-being at various levels of governance. And that feeds in, as Julianne said, in terms of the objectives of this webinar. So whilst the three projects have taken this different approaches and have had different scales, so in Imagine we've looked more to regional scale compared to RELOCAL with a focus more on the local scale, and Cosmo focused more on urban issues. Although we've taken slight differences, the concept of spatial justice has been core for each of us. And as many of you I think will be familiar, spatial justice is a relatively new idea in policy discourse and discussion within the European Union, but in academic terms it has a longer legacy. It emerges from a number of different places, partly from the work of Henri Lefebvre and his ideas about the right to the city, and the development in the French spatial justice school, but equally from aspects of Marxist geography and the work of David Harvey and ideas of territorial justice, and then the later elaboration of that, particularly by the American geographer Ed Soldier, who looks at spatial justice, particularly in urban context, urban spatial justice. But as quoted here, from Soldiers' work in particular, we can see this value of spatial justice, of what it tries to do. So Soldier writes here that spatial injustice refers to an intentional and focused emphasis on the spaces or geographical aspects of justice and injustice. And as a starting point, this involves a fair and equitable distribution in space of socially valued resources and opportunities to use them. And I think what's important is it goes beyond just distribution. So the second quote here is from the RELOCAL deliverable conceptual framework, which again I think summarizes this this dual nature of spatial justice well, that spatial justice focuses on both the just geographic distribution of resources and opportunities and on the power relations that cause injustice between social groups and between spaces. So to elaborate on that, the way in which we particularly approach spatial justice in the Imagine project has been to think about these different tiers, if you like, these different layers that spatial justice allows us to think about. So yes, at one level, it's about inequalities in the distribution of wealth and well-being, but it also goes beyond that to be about the distribution and targeting of state resources and policies, including public services and economic policy. Beyond that, to be also about the processes through which those state resources are distributed. And it's also about the perceived fairness of these processes and the operation of power within them, including the fairness of the representation of different territories and their interests. And I often think about it this way, that when we talk about territorial inequalities, which is one part of our brief, the measurement of territorial inequalities is quantitative. We can measure them. We can come up with a mathematical statement about how equal, how unequal things are. But the evaluation of justice is qualitative, and spatial justice takes us into that qualitative dimension. And it's this which I think allows us to use spatial justice as a critique of European cohesion and regional policies. And again, I think in both RELOCAL and Imagine, we've articulated similar critiques here. So on the one hand, you have the European social model, which is concerned with spatial justice, but hasn't had explicit spatial dimensions. On the other hand, you have the European regional development policy, which is focused on addressing territorial inequalities in that quantitative measure, but hasn't really focused on questions of justice. And some kind of indications of that are the way in which in the distribution of regional development funds, structural funds, the indicators employed in those distribution resources have been too narrowly focused, particularly on GDP as a measure, to fully capture the ways in which people experience spatial justice, although that's beginning to change in the new programming period. And equally, the spatial units used in that distribution of resources are arguably too large to reflect the local nuances of spatial injustice. And again, I think most people here will be familiar with this, but just to emphasize those points, one of the things we did in Imagine was to do some analysis exploring that, to make the point from the first hand that the spatial pattern of territorial inequalities varies depending on the indicators being used. These maps aren't especially helpful in that the shading is slightly different. So the middle one, the darker area, so the lighter areas, the poorer regions, whereas the right hand map, the darker areas, the poorer regions. But nonetheless, I think it helps you get a sense that there are slight differences on that geographical pattern, depending on whether we look at GDP and mean household income or risk of poverty and social exclusion. And similarly, the spatial pattern of territorial inequalities varies with the scale of analysis. So on the left hand, we have the NUTS 2 regions we use in structural funds, mean household income there. But in the Imagine project, we did some spatial disaggregation work to break down those indicators to more local levels. And as you see on the right side there, you get a much more nuanced picture, including intra-regional differences, often between urban and rural areas, and co-periphery patterns within regions. So the conclusion we draw from this is that those measures which conventionally have been used in European structural funds and regional development policy are primarily quantitative and don't really fully capture people's experiences of spatial justice and injustice. And that means that there can be a narrowing of quantitative measures of territorial inequalities and growing perceptions of spatial injustice at the same time. So a second thing we did in Imagine was to think more about those perceptions, and we carried out a panel survey of over 18,000 participants in 8 countries, and in that survey we asked questions about perceptions of territorial inequalities and spatial injustices, about solidarity, about territorial autonomy, and also some questions around migration, which were linked to one of the other work. And just to highlight a couple of the findings from this, if we look, for example, we asked people at their perception of relative quality of, on the one hand, the public services, and in the second case here, economic or employment opportunities within their regions. And what you see here, the green, the darker green areas are the better ratings, the browns are the lower ratings of relative quality. And again, you see different patterns emerging here, depending on what we ask about, but also different patterns here from what we see in the conventional maps of territorial inequality. We also asked about what people thought the key factors driving uneven economic development. In this figure, we flag structural reasons such as geographical location, but also industrial location, economic policy. And again, you see some variation between the countries, but we also compare here answers by respondents in less developed regions in black and more developed regions in yellow. And this indicates a slight tendency in the less developed regions to attribute economic disadvantage to where industries have been located, and by proxy then with economic policy. And that just perhaps indicate a perception that there's an unfair distribution of economic investment and industrial investment shaping these territorial inequalities. We asked about solidarity between regions, again, whether people were willing to help other lagging regions in the same country or elsewhere in the EU or on a global scale. And again, we could spend a lot of time talking about the nuances in these results, but the broad picture here is actually that there is fairly widespread support for solidarity, for helping more lagging regions, with perhaps the exception of the Dutch not being keen on helping other parts of the European Union. But apart from that, there's plenty broad support for solidarity. And then finally, in terms of preferred models of government, and this graph shows preferences. The blue on the left-hand side are centralised government. The orange and grey are varying degrees of decentralisation, and yellow is a federal system. And again, there's differences in results between countries and within countries, but the broad message is that generally the preference is for more forms of decentralisation. In other words, more territorial autonomy. So from these findings, we can make a statement that spatial justice is a political question as much as an economic question. And that means it also has political consequences. And we see this, for example, in the way that spatial justice can act as a driver for territorial autonomy movements. So further work package in Imagine, we looked at the claims being made by territorial autonomy movements in different parts of Europe. And what we found is that they quite rarely frame their claims around social and economic inequalities and most quantitative measures, but those claims are commonly framed around perceptions of the fairness of power relations and ideas of spatial justice. So spatial justice we want to have driving autonomy movements, and we've perhaps also seen it in recent years in terms of spatial justice driving the rise of populism in many parts of Europe. And Andrés Rodriguez poses now well-known argument that populism is the revenge of places that don't matter. And again, I think the phrasing of this claim, again, we can debate the particular merits of this hypothesis, but I think that the phrasing of this claim, the places that don't matter, is interesting. Again, it's not the revenge of economically lagging regions as defined by relative GDP. It's about perception, and it's about those places that feel they're being unfairly treated in the political system. And we see that a good example of that is the way in the Brexit referendum in the UK, many of the regions that voted most strongly to leave the European Union were also the greatest recipients of EU structural funding. And that creates a disjuncture there. And that, in a sense, leads us to the European Union's dilemma in this, that European cohesion and regional development policies have made a quantifiable difference in reducing interregional socioeconomic inequalities. Again, there's some qualifications, but that statement generally holds at a broad level. However, this arguably hasn't been reflected in perceptions of spatial justice. And we can perhaps argue that there are actually growing feelings of spatial injustice over the distribution of resources, access to power, the benefits of economic growth, and so on, which have been exploited by populist and autonomous movements, which in turn could threaten the European project. The dilemma is also that, as our survey showed, there is broad public support both for solidarity between regions, but also for more forms of decentralised government and territorial autonomy. And those two emphases arguably point in very different directions for Europe's future. So the final part of Imagine is to play with or develop some scenarios for the future territorial equalities and spatial justice in Europe. This is ongoing work, but this is where we're up to at present, that we've used two axes of high levels of solidarity. This is high levels of autonomy, but also the second axis between an emphasis on economic growth and one on broader measures of well-being. And what we see, those four broad positions, what we call the silver citadel of high solidarity and emphasis on growth. And within that, spatial justice is perhaps the equitable distribution of wealth. It's arguably the continuation of current EU policies or approaches there. On the top right-hand side, we have high levels of solidarity, but emphasis on well-being, what we call the Green Guardians. And here, spatial justice perhaps means more about regions helping each other to respond to change, and particularly the climate crisis. In the left-hand bottom corner, we have the Silicon Scaffold, high levels of autonomy and a focus on economic growth. So spatial justice is about the right to grow and generate wealth. And that perhaps is certainly what part of the rhetoric around Brexit was about, was articulating that particular vision. And the final corner of high autonomy and high well-being and emphasis on well-being, the patchwork rainbow with spatial justice is about cultural autonomy and local solidarity. Now, these scenarios are quite deliberately pushing to the extremes, and I think most of us would actually prefer a future somewhere in the middle of this diagram, combining this. So my final point is to actually ask, can we actually square these different elements? Can we bring these together? And this takes me back to thinking about another aspect of spatial justice, which is that spatial justice is not just a tool for analysis, it can also be a normative concept. And there may be different ways of expressing that, as we saw in those scenarios, but from progressive viewpoints, spatial and social justice should go together. And that means that territorial autonomy without solidarity, without thinking about the broader distribution of resources, is not spatially just. And therefore we want to combine these elements more to our normative view of spatial justice. Perhaps therefore means it must mean both reducing quantifiable territorial inequalities and also addressing perceptions of unfairness between regions. In the context of EU policy, that means fitting EU cohesion policies with mechanisms to enable and demonstrate spatial fairness. What might that mean in practice? Well, it might mean things like reframing structural funds, cohesion policy, so that there is more emphasis on bottom-up and responsive approaches to economic development, with wider integrated perspectives that move beyond narrow economic indicators to consider the multiple factors shaping perceptions of relative well-being. It might mean being territorial agile, in other words, not just tied to those standard NUTS2 regions, and alert to the spatial inequalities within regions, the dynamics behind those. It means being transparent and accountable in decision making. And it means an approach based on broad, meaningful participation of citizens and stakeholders with visible results from that participation. And to pull that together, to summarize that, I think that means that putting spatial justice into practice means embracing place-based and participative action. And this, I think, is where some of the work which has been done in the RELOCAL really comes in here, in the local level work of exploring how those approaches can be implemented in practice. And that's what I'm looking forward to hearing about in the rest of the case studies this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I would then like to go on. So if there is any urgent question for understanding, not a general questions we will have at the end, but if there is something urgent that needs to be asked yet, but I don't see anything, you can write in the chat or you can raise your hand. But otherwise, we would like to go on to take the bridge from emerging to RELOCAL and to present some of the case studies, bottom-up and top-down case studies, to have the discussion afterwards about the top-down and bottom-up discussion. So I would like to hand over.
Okay. Thank you, Bert, and thank you, Michael. This was already a good start, and we now know the task to redefine the definition as from bottom up and top down, what it actually means for us. So I would like to start the cases the RELOCAL researchers prepared for us. These are only a little glimpse out of overall 33 studies. And the session is geographically focusing on Eastern and Southeastern Europe. So consider this also a little experiment to discover if we can also observe some specifiers of this region here. We will start with Paulina presenting the Goth village in Poland as an example of place-based development strategy. If you need help, yeah, let me know.
Yes, thank you very much. I will share my screen. Hopefully it worked before, so it will be fine now. Yes. Is it working? Do you see the presentation? Yes?
We see perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, so once again, good afternoon to everybody. My name is Paulina Tobias-Schliess, and on behalf of our team from the University of Łódź, I would like to present results of one of the 4 case studies we were working on along the RELOCAL project. Today we have a pleasure to show you, to present to you the case of the Goth village in Masłomęcz as the example of place-based development strategy. Just to start with, I would like to introduce in brief some main drivers of change affecting contemporary rural areas of Poland, as we are undergoing intensive transitions there. One is the dynamic emergence of a multifunctional rural regime, which influences new non-productive functions in local economies and also new lifestyles reflected in the rural landscape. And the second one is the empowerment of local communities, and thus the strong reinforcement of social and territorial identity, especially since 1990s, when self-governance in local and regional scale has been restored in Poland. So the presentation today shows the path towards very widely understood rural renewal, reflected by redefining local identity and multifunctional development undertaken by a very specific local community in the area that was economically and socially impoverished. And here, thematic village, based on very strong local historical assets, appeared to be a successful tool in this process. To introduce Masłomęcz as a settlement, as the place, it is peripherally located in terms of Poland as a country settlement, 9 kilometers from the border with Ukraine by the river Bug in the Lubelskie Voivodeship. It is a small but very dispersed settlement, inhabited by approximately 380 people, 100 households, more or less. According to Eurostat, it is predominantly rural area, and it is also dominated by agricultural production, thanks to very good and fertile soils, and also the climate allowing high agricultural production. So mainly white beets, and the wheat is produced in this region. Sorry for the weather on that picture. This is the finish of white beets harvesting. The first time we've been to Masłomęcz, it was late October, but this is how it looks like in early summer. before harvests begin. Still, the very first moments in Masłomenj seems to disappoint against a very long and interesting history of the region. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a very specific community in the village of Masłomenj, as the contemporary character of the whole region of southeastern Poland is marked by very complex set of political and historical and demographic factors. So the former multicultural society that framed the region here has undergone during the war and the post-war period, and among the most important of these was the resettlement of Ukrainians from Poland to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in the years 1945 and 46. And also the Vistula action in 1947 that aimed at resettling Ukrainians from this region to the western and northern regions of Poland. So together with resettling Polish population repatriated from the USSR after the Second World War, it made the whole population, the whole demographic structure new in this area, and the former splendor of the village can only be seen in partly preserved patterns of roads or fields, plots, and only the oldest inhabitants mention non-existing places, which they only heard about when settling down with their families in the 50s. So this is the example of the house of settlers resettled to Masłomenj after the Second World War. So every family received a similar house and the same amount of land to work on, and those people coming from different parts of former Poland before the Second World War, from the eastern parts of our country before the Second World War started, they were completely new in this place. They had to learn the place. They had to learn the area, and they also had to learn themselves. As to thematic village, when it came out in Masłomenj, it appeared during archaeological excavations between 1977 and 2002 that close to the village of Masłomenj there were Goths settling down between the 2nd and the 4th century. And the whole settlement of Goths is estimated at about 2,000 people. So it appeared that this place, around 1,700 years ago, was a really huge center of the Goth population. It was the 70s that those excavations started, so the population here settled in the 50s was like discovering that history together with archaeologists, and it became something that was common to all of them in this new territory that they were settled in. So it is very important here that Masłomenj is the example of thematic village developed on the basis of authentic historical assets of the place. Of course, in a narrow sense, thematization of space is focused on selecting some leitmotifs for places, events, or people, which become the basis for creating tourist products and serves mainly the marketing purposes. But here in Masłomianj, we have to think about thematization in a broad sense as the model for development of local, in this case rural community, providing the basis for acquiring, creating and developing the local identity. So this is how it started, from excavations in 1977 when they started, and were continued for 25 years. So it was like a generation, and those archaeological excavations that took place every summer were like a new element in this, you know, very important in rural communities, the circle of life, natural circle of life. And archaeologists coming every summer were like an important part of every year of this local community. Children observing archaeologists, students digging this Goth heritage out of the ground became later on students in the Lublin University, and today they also come back to the village to work in the Goth Village Association. So it was really important, 25 years being a very important part of the village. I mean, those excavations. So they took place up to 2002, and when they were closed, you know how it works. Archaeologists just put the holes. They put the ground back to the holes. They just take all the important things they took out of the ground to museums, and they just leave nothing. So the local community had a very strong sense of loss. Well, since 2002, nothing happened during the summer. So in 2004, they just came out with the idea to come back, to bring back archaeology to Masłomianj. The very important role here was the role of leaders, archaeologists from Lublin University working here for 25 years, but also regional museum in Hrubieszów, local authorities, and also Farmers' Wives Association as a partner in that project. And 2004 was, of course, the accession of Poland to the European Union. And new possibilities to develop the idea. So 2006, the establishment of Leader Action Group, Better Tomorrow, and some projects introduced since 2007 focused on promoting cultural heritage and increasing tourist attractiveness of this place. One of the most important elements was to establish a Goth squad, a Goth group, people who just identify themselves with the Goths, dress like the Goths, and learn skills and customs of the Goths population that was discovered by archaeologists here. And since 2010, the project developed and spread in the neighboring areas as well. So the wider territorial development was also also undertaken, and Swiss contribution project from vision to modern management of Gotynia was mainly focused on developing the idea of thematic village to the nearest neighborhood. As to the whole action from the idea of thematization of rural space to spatial justice, we used along the RELOCAL project the framework of the theory of change, which has been used here to highlight somehow the causal pathway between the action and the goal of local development of Masłomędź. And it also considers how different aspects of the wider environment affect the intermediate outcomes here. So from the action towards the renewal of this peripherally located rural area, we had two main interventions based on local development strategy, and also this more social, bringing archaeology back to Masłomędź, and some intermediate outcomes were like the growth of community mutual trust, enhanced human capital, greater sense of belonging of people who were just new in this territory, and demographic sustainability, because people are coming back. And we observe strengthened social capital, also thanks to this central role of the Goth Village Association, which is also important in terms of the access to funds to develop the idea. But on the other side, we have also the help and the important role of locality, like the plot of land purchased by the municipality and gave to the Goth Association to develop the open air museum presenting the local heritage, historical heritage of the Goths population. So new economic activities came later, and it also influenced multifunctional rural development of the area. So this is how Goths in Masłomędź, contemporary Goths in Masłomędź, look like, and they learn crafts, they learn customs, and they also do living history lessons and some events for local people, but also for other people. Those effects of thematic Goth village on local development can be discussed within social, economic, and spatial terms. So for sure, we see the development of social interest in the village past, new skills and social relations, and also strong local and regional identity. But it was, as I said, the trigger for the multifunctional development. New economic activities came out, local products and events, and the open air museum became the new central place of this dispersed settlement. So we have new landscape forms, architectural dominance, and also the preservation, regeneration of existing places, important in the scope of the action. Maybe to illustrate better those effects. And a very important element is the network of the most interesting villages in Poland. Masłomędź is one of those most interesting villages in Poland, as also the example of places interesting to be visited. So yes, I think I will finish now. Thank you for your attention. I could skip those slides; they were just additional in case I would have some more time, but I usually don't. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Paulina. I also hope we are still hoping for the final conference to elaborate more about the cases too. Let's move directly to the very charming film of the Hungarian team.
We can't see it now.
No, I had to do it for motion. I hope now.
Good afternoon, colleagues. We are giving this presentation about the Balaton upland leader leg from Balaton-Csicsó, one of the nicest villages of the area. Gustav Nemes is next to me. He lives in this village, therefore he has provided during our work a view of an insider. My name is Katalin Kovács.
And Kati has been the external eye in this project. So, shall we start?
Yes?
So, what is to come? We will tell you the story of how and why a local leader action group in Hungary succeeded to achieve notable structural improvements in social and spatial justice and rural development in general. But first, let's see some theoretical background.
Development is place-based if it relies to a large extent on local vernacular knowledge. To access and integrate local knowledge into a development action, leaders suggest the method of bottom-up participatory strategy building, within which planning and community building intertwine. It channels information flows, provides discussion platforms, and generates trust among decision makers and the population. And thus, it helps tailoring development to local needs. The Balaton Uplands leg was established in 2007 and has become one of the most successful legs in Hungary. Leader was, so to say, mainstreamed at the level of the EU those days. According to the Hungarian translation of mainstream leader, Axis 4, leader as a separate measure, and Axis 3 were delivered through legs in a decentralized, devolved manner. The program was extended to the entire rural area, meaning that a network of local legs emerged as agents of rural development policy, guided and controlled by the relatively well-functioning but James-phased set of central authorities. The enabling phase of these authorities showed themselves up in adequate financial support and centrally guided know-how transmission, whilst the constraining phase were evidenced by strict rules and control and complex procedures. In the Balaton Uplands area, enthusiasm, openness, high expectation towards EU programs, and a high level of trust towards those who delivered them prevailed during the 2007-2013 iteration of the LEADER program. These conditions were optimal for calling and successfully including stakeholders into a participatory process, which finally led to a highest possible exploitation of the local development repertoire.
Part of the communication strategy of the leg was using videos and community filmmaking. As a result, there are lots of films and short videos about their work and achievements, and now we can bring their story a bit closer to you. So we start this with a short introduction of the territory and the leg itself.
Balaton környékének az egyik legjobb társadalmi szervezete.
Amikor legelőször összejöttünk, 20%-át nem ismertük egymásnak.
59 település vidékfejlesztését koordinálja, Sümektől a művészetek völgyén át egészen a Balatonig.
A LEADER vidékfejlesztési program, maga a vidékfejlesztési stratégia szintén 4 fő pilléren nyugszik. ez a helyi termékek népszerűsítése a védjegyprogramunk mentén, a turisztikai kínálat fejlesztése a túraútvonalrendszer mentén, az ifjúság megtartás és letelepedésük elősegítése, illetve a társadalmi együttműködéseknek az erősítése.
Erőnkön felül teljesítettünk, és az eredményeink is erőn felüliek, ami láthatóak az Egyesület elismeréseiből, a kitüntetéseiből.
Balaton Uplands Leg became one of the most acknowledged local development groups in Hungary. As you have seen in the video, and you can also see from the numbers on this slide, they achieved impressive outputs. However, beyond the numbers, they achieved many more very important long-term impacts as well. They developed partnerships and a community within a new geographical framework that never existed before, and managed to balance all this in an extremely variable spatial framework. The region covers a quite large area with significantly different parts, from the Lake Balaton, that is one of Hungary's most touristic regions, through areas of broken down old heavy industry and mining, to very rural inner peripheries with scattered settlements. These areas have very different social structure, economic, cultural and natural environment. Networking and cooperation culture is also quite different. But if you look at the spending during the 2007-13 period, it's easy to see that the spending was actually quite balanced between these three microregions. I mean, the best example is that there are 15 highly disadvantaged villages. They cover 8% of the population of the whole area. And these 15 villages received 15% of the support. That is a spectacular result, since in the most disadvantaged villages there is little human, cultural, financial capital, so it's difficult to generate projects there, and they still manage to do this. Besides the enabling institutional environment that Kati already talked about, the other important external factor was that we are talking about the era of the rise of the rural tourism in Hungary, that helped a lot of small business to flourish. Concerning internal success factors, we could say that the most important was that these guys have taken leader method really seriously. They created well-functioning, good institutions for governance, for making decisions, and for management at the same time. The local development agency was full of highly committed, really knowledgeable people. At the same time, expert knowledge was available from the very beginning of the working of the leader group. Some people living and working in the area helped them to access the international pool of knowledge on local rural development. So they took part in exchange programs, could adapt best practices in their work. The best example of how all this functioned is the own projects of the local action group. These were to develop the basic texture for local rural development in the area. We are going to show you two examples of these. The first is the Hungarian adaptation of a program invented more than 20 years ago in Spain, Calidad Rural, or European Territorial Quality Mark in English. It's a very complex system built through participatory bottom-up processes. It achieves to be global and local at the same time, developing the quality of local products and services based on the will of these local producers and service providers, but also developing the quality of the enterprises to European standards of economic and social responsibility. The Balaton Uplands leader lag, together with some other Hungarian lags, adapted this Spanish-European system into the Hungarian circumstances. Please have a look at the next video that tells you a little bit more about this.
A balatonfelvidéki termékek és szolgáltatások népszerűsítése és minőségi színvonalának emelése érdekében az Egyesületünk bevezette 2014-ben a Vidék minősége éltető Balatonfelvidék védjegyet. Ezzel tulajdonképpen csatlakoztunk egy nemzetközi programhoz is.
Vidékfejlesztés az egy nagyon szerteágazó terület, egyedül soha nem tudsz elég okos lenni.
A LEADER-ben alapvető, hogy megnézzük, mit csinálnak a többi országban. A nemzetközi együttműködés a mindennapi munkánk szerves része.
Az egyik legfontosabb tanácsa volt az Aurelio Bermúdeznek, a spanyol LEADER szövetség elnökének, hogy hálózatot építsünk, hogy hozzunk létre kapcsolatokat, mert az fogja a legjobban segíteni a munkánkat.
A nemzetközi együttműködés a LEADER központi eleme, hiszen az egész program az európai gondolatban gyökerezik.
Tehát annak nagyon sok előnye van, hogyha mi külföldre látogatunk, és látunk ott projekteket, vagy látjuk, hogy ott egy ottani akciócsoport hogyan működik, miket valósított már meg, mert azt az ötletet hazahozva, adoptálva a helyi körülményekre, mi is tudunk egy hasonlót lebonyolítani, amit itthon, a saját köreinkben nem biztos, hogy eszünkbe jutott volna.
A számomra a legnagyobb érték az, hogy részt vehetek benne, üzletünkön, a primáruházzal.
Hát a védett programmal tulajdonképpen megkaptuk azt az elismerést, amin mi munkálkodtunk idestova most már 8 éve. Egyfajta megerősítése annak, hogy mi jó úton járunk.
Az éltető a védjegyeseket 3 nyelven megjeleníti a honlapján. Van már egy termékkatalógusunk is, ahol nem csak a fogyasztók, hanem a közvetítő kereskedők is pontos információt kaphatnak a védjegyes termékekről.
Évente több rendezvényt ad lehetőséget arra, hogy egységes arculattal megjelenjünk az éltető Balatonfelvidék védjegy népszerűsítésére. Ilyen például minden év novemberében a Bakony Expo Veszprémben, vagy az országos védjegyes találkozó Bánkon, illetve Fertőszéklakon, és Kapolcson a Csügaházban megjelenünk védjegyes helyi termelőinkkel és kézműveseinkkel.
Egyre erősebb a vállalkozói szellem. Ha egy ilyen jó akciócsoport áll mögöttünk, mint az éltető Balatonfelvidék, hatalmas motiváló erőt jelent, mert nagyon sok munkát elvégeznek helyettünk.
...2016-ban kialakítottuk az éltetőpontot, ahol vidékminősége éltető Balatonfelvidék védjegyes termékeket lehet vásárolni, illetve a szolgáltatásokról is részletesebb információhoz juthatnak.
Meg tudtuk oldani azt, hogy behozzuk az üzletünkbe a védjegyes termékeket, hogy például egy Óbudaván, vagy Monoszlon megtermelt terméket a Balatonparton piacra tudjuk bocsájtani, és a termelőnek nem ott kell állni a piacon, hanem az üzletbe el tudjuk adni, amíg ő tud termelni.
Egyfajta hovatartozást ad, egy nagyon jó érzést, hogy egy olyan csoportnak, csapatnak, identitásnak lehetek a tagja, aki megfelel egy szabályzatnak, és társadalmi és gazdasági hatása is van.
És az együttműködésnek egy szellemi értéke növelő hatás van, és ezekről mindig elfelejtkezünk beszélni, pedig nagyon fontosak.
Jól látni és tapasztalni azt, hogy az egyéni érdek mellett a közösségi érdek került előtérbe. Rájöttünk arra, hogy akkor tudunk csak igazán nagyot előrelépni, hogyha együtt dolgozunk ennek a vidéknek a fejlődéséért.
The next example is a GIS-based network of local food paths. It was again a very participatory bottom-up project. Please have a look at the film. It will tell you much more than I could.
A túradvans projekt arról szólt, hogy megpróbáljunk a helyiekkel közösen túraútvonalakat kialakítani. 180 túraútvonalat tudtunk kialakítani így.
Az, hogy mi jelenjen meg ezekben a túraútvonalakban, az egy lakossági fórumon dőlt el. Hoztunk egy térképet, kiterítettük emberek elé, és akkor elkezdtünk beszélgetni.
Tehát nem igazából azt próbáltuk megtenni, hogy jön egy turisztikai szakember, megmondja, hogy mi nektek az érték, és akkor azokat felvisszük egy útvonalra, hanem ők saját maguk sorolták fel az értékeket, ezeket kategorizáltuk, rendszereztük, és amikor felrajzoltuk az értékeket a térképre, akkor gyönyörűen mutatta magát, hogy körülbelül melyek azok az értékek, amelyek mentén útvonalakat lehetne kialakítani. Utána végig gondoltuk még azt is, hogy ezek a túrák kinek ajánlhatók, milyen érdekességek, legendák, sztorik köthetők hozzá, hol lehetne még gyűjteni, milyen szolgáltatók vannak, akiket érdemes ajánlani a túraútvonal mentén. Néhány kollégánk az útvonal pontjait és magát az útvonalat is GPS készülékkel rögzítette, közben fotókat is készített, és amikor ez összeállt, akkor az összes információt átadta az informatikusnak, aki felvitte ezt a webes felületre. A legváltozatosabb útvonalak születtek az egyszerű falusétától a pokol túrájáig, ami éppen a pokolighoz vezet, vagy olyan útvonalat alakítottak ki, ami babakocsival járható, kifejezetten olyanoknak, akik kisgyerekkel jönnek. A projekt egyet része sokkal többet, meg összességében is azt gondolom, hogy sokkal többet adott annál, mint hogy túraútvonalakat alakítottunk ki. Egy olyan párbeszédre tudtuk késztetni a turisztikai szereplőket, helyi szereplőket, ami nagyon-nagyon hiányzik, azt gondolom, egy jó ideje már.
Mint polgármester, testközelből is tapasztaltam, hogy az összefogásnak milyen jelentős ereje van. Az ember azt hinné, hogy a vendéglők, a panziók konkurenciák egymásnak, nem. Én csodáltal tapasztalom, hogy itt az összefogás, ami közöttük is van, hogy egymásnak között adják a vendégeket.
Azáltal, hogy van egy komplex GPS-es, gyalogos, lovas, túraútvonal hálózat, ez potenciális lehetőséget nyújt arra, hogy az itt élők a boldogulásukat még jobban megtalálják.
Compared to the previous iteration, the 2014-2020 period can be classified as an era of shrinking and decline. LEADER has become part of the Rural Development Program as a single measure. None of the other measures were implemented through the legs, resulting in a considerable diminishing of financial allocations, both at the program and the local levels. In the meantime, overall government reforms took place and ended up in significant downscaling of the personnel, leading to loss of human capacities also in both central and local levels. The Balaton Uplands leg had to face the same challenges as all the other legs across the country. Its financial support and personnel of the management dropped to 1/4 of the previous iterations, and it has mainly survived from past energies and tries to continue until a better future arrives. Concluding remarks. Bottom-up participatory development in the Balaton Uplands area yielded remarkable success in the 2007-2013 programming cycle, manifested in a diminishing gap between developed and lagging subregions, stronger entrepreneurship, strengthened lower middle class and lag community. Bottom-up and participatory processes offered by the LEADER approach are, however, necessary but insufficient conditions of successful place-based development. As the 2014-20 iteration of the program indicates, worsening regulatory and institutional environments can fundamentally change conditions of success. This is what the Balaton LEADER case exemplifies.
Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Please just look at the results of the LEADER group and the LEADER program for another minute. Goodbye. Goodbye.
you had understand everything. I had to stop it here because of timing issues, but we will provide the link to the video so you can also rewatch it and also have the final pictures. Let's move on to a top-down example provided by the Greek team. Angeliki.
Hello, everybody. I would like to thank you, Julian, for giving us an opportunity to present our case study today. It is a pleasure to do so. I'm going to share my screen, even though it is in German. Okay. Right now, can you see my presentation? Perfect. Okay. Well, the presentation was prepared by myself and my two colleagues, Lefteris Topaloglou and Victor Kupza. I'm going to close the camera just to have a little bit better. I don't know. Anyway, our study, it is one of those case studies, top-down approaches. The title is Place-Based Strategies in Innovation Ecosystems. And we are presenting the case of Alexander Innovation Zone, which is located in Thessaloniki. Now, basically our study, it is an attempt to scrutinize the state's initiative, which deals with innovation at the regional level. And this happens through the spatial justice. Our focus is on localities and the decentralization. And basically, it will deliver the demands of spatial justice. Now, the main hypothesis to be tested in our studies is the equity in socially valued resources and opportunities that can better achieve through place-based strategies. Now, why Alexander Innovation Zone is interesting? First of all, the metropolitan area demonstrates low innovation performances and low rate of setting up innovative and dynamic enterprises. Now, at the same time, there are dramatic losses of income and employment due to the economic crisis of 2007. We don't talk about COVID now. Now, what is the zone's mission? The zone's mission is the development and management of an innovation ecosystem and the establishment of a collaborative platform between academics, research, and business community within the locality. The empirical work has been articulated upon some key notions. First of all, the locality, and second of all, the policy-driven actions. Locality, within our literature review, is defined as multifarious and porous at the intersection of vertical and horizontal and transversal forces. On the other hand, policy-driven action within the locality refers to the place-based approaches which have an identifiable impact on the locality, of course, aiming to promote the spatial justice. Now, based on these two definitions, key notions, the zone demonstrates obvious challenges of the spatial justice, coping with strategies to improve the local innovation system. Just 1 second. So it will act as a connecting platform within the academic, research, and business web. Now, what are the main characteristics or the profile of this area? First of all, the metropolitan area of Thessaloniki sprawls over a total area of 1,285 square kilometers. The population density of Thessaloniki is approximately 7,100 residents per square kilometer. And the city has one of the largest student population in Greece and continues to be an attractive option to live for students and youngsters. Now, from the point of view of business and innovation perspective, evidence exhibits that there are low rates of setting up new and modern manufacturing enterprises, and of course, it's far from internationally competitive standards. Now, the profile of the area. We continue. Low innovation output indexes. For several years, the indexes reflect the so-called paradox of demonstrating moderate innovation performances. And there is a great potential of innovation. The Central Macedonia, the region, includes the metropolitan city of Thessaloniki, has a significant lower GDP per capita, which is equal to 77% of the national average. Now, in terms of the innovation performance, the regional and its capital, Thessaloniki, appears to have an innovative consumer and, of course, innovation producer. The low innovation output indexes lasting for the several years indicate that local industry demonstrates low or no demand of innovation. There is a high level of research activity and knowledge production by a number of scientific entities and initiatives, and the performance of the locality in the field of innovation remains still low. The region ranks higher to national average of tertiary education and also has a higher national and also higher than the national EU average. At the international scientific publications, most cited scientific publications in public sector. Now, in terms of innovation performance, the region and its capital appears to have as innovation consumer than they are more innovation consumer than innovation producer. So the low innovation output indexes lasting for several years indicate that local industry demonstrates low or no demand for innovation. Now, all these above facts indicate a weak efficiency of the regional innovation policy in capitalizing the locality's research and knowledge assets. In the same vein, empirical evidence has shown that research and innovation has been a priority in the regional policy agenda. The attention has been focused on policy areas and initiatives that could produce visible results, such as works and infrastructure. In terms of the policy-driven action of this area, has been initiated by the state in 2006. The main argument is the establishment of the zone. It was that in Thessaloniki, there is an extensive academic research and business community that can formulate an efficient metropolitan innovation system. Now, the zone's role is to create and develop and establish a permanent cooperation platform between associations, companies, research institutions of the public and private sectors, thus placing emphasis on purposes of common benefits and public interest, functioning as a magnet of large and small enterprises. Now, who is supervising the zone? The zone is supervised by the Minister of Interior, appointed in a form of company as the managing board of the local innovation ecosystem. Decision-making is based upon a board of directors, appointed, of course, by the Ministry of Macedonia, and some local key stakeholders. This is the city of Thessaloniki, okay, and this is the innovation zone. Now, in order to finalize some conclusions and to come up with some answers, we use qualitative methods to investigate the chosen case, field research, questionnaires, expert interviews, and of course some legislator and laws referring to the zone. We also use some documents, statistics, evaluation reports, studies, etc., in order to come up with the following conclusions. Now, in terms of answering our questions, in this study, we address the locally driven action of the Alexander Innovation Zone. These local specificities concern the unique historical, geographic, and economic profile of Thessaloniki. These settings designs, to a certain extent, the scope, limitations, and potential for the local actors to shape and address a place-based agenda. Now, in terms of answering our questions, when the question of autonomy comes into play, it becomes clear that the degree to which decentralization is related to spatial justice depends on the institutional characteristics of decentralization. It is unconventional that the administrative settings in Greece has strong centralized character in terms of spatial organization and configuration of power. In addition, the focus of the current administration for Kallikratis has been placed rather on state efficient than on autonomous itself due to the recent economic crisis. Given this background, the empirical analysis has revealed that the state mechanisms proved to be bureaucratic, over-regulating, sluggish, and inefficient, offering plenty of room for highly political interventions. Furthermore, and based on this evidence, one may assert that such kind of aggregate efficiency approaches, which basically are based on national and institutional intervention with no concern of territorial specificities, are not able to contribute to spatial justice. To this top-down and place-neutral perspective seems to reproduce spatial injustice. Once the question resolves around whether top-down or bottom-up contribute better to spatial justice, the empirical evidence suggests that both policy-making perspectives should not be considered to be mutually exclusive. The process of multi-level governments in the case of the zone seems to be more appropriate to achieve a better distribution of resources and opportunities and better mechanism to ensure an efficient innovation ecosystem in the locality. Now, in terms of investigating the impact of redistributive policies on endogenous growth, some interesting findings emerge. According to the dominant perceptions, it seems that an intra-regional financial transfer from one region to another, treated as a conveyor belt alone, would not necessarily provide the panacea for addressing inequalities. So spatial injustice, if does not it will not mobilize endogenous dynamics. So there is no room for simplistic recipes. Now, summing up, a place-based policy should appreciate the characteristics of the regional innovation ecosystem, including all key stakeholders in order to facilitate the development of knowledge and business networks in a spatial context. Thank you very much for your attention. I was a little bit on time. I was on time. So
thank you for being on time. Thanks. Yeah. And also to already focus on conclusions. This is really helpful to move over to our next.
Sorry, just.
Are you
okay? Can you see my screen now? Oh, no.
No, you are.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're private now. Thank you. So we are moving to the Romanian team who prepared a little evaluation of the approach for us. You need help with the presentation. Just tell me. I have them.
Yeah, Julian, if you could put out the PowerPoint I sent you. So,
yeah. Okay. Good.
Right. I'll just have a couple of minutes, so it's roughly.
That's why. Yeah, I will help you. No problem.
Okay, thanks. So when we first discussed with Julian about how this case should be presented, I was pretty skeptical to present it as a top-down action, but there are indeed some questions on this in this particular format. So a bit of context first. The Micro-Regional Association Marea Natur was founded in 2011. It is one of the 239 local action groups in Romania operating under the LEADER program. It is also one of the 4 LAGs functioning in the Maramureș County, hence the name, which is placed in the northwestern part of the country. Yeah, you can see there Băiaș-Prie almost in the middle of the map, and you can see with the red outlining this peculiar shape of the territory. Now, the area has some very difficult economic history. Mining for polymetals has been one of the most important activity until 20 years ago, when, because of regulations and impositions, the whole activity stopped. And although economically it's somewhat recovered, it is still the poorest county in the otherwise blooming northwestern region of Romania. Emigration rates skyrocketed, so we have to also wonder who else is left there and what kind of abilities, resources, and knowledge they possess in order to support the LEADER territorial experiment. The shape of the LAG's territory of 1,250 square kilometers is a bit unorthodox, so it stretches between 2 cities, one of which is the county capital, while the other one is even more secluded. It is the losing city in the initial bid for the LAG assembly. The furthest villages from Băiaș-Prie shouldn't have been a part of this LAG if a strict reading of LEADER principles was applied. The shape in itself is the result of local networking and political acumen of the mayor of Băiaș-Prie and his team. This territorial assemblage is one of the most compelling examples that we are dealing with a form of bottom-up initiative. Unfortunately, there are not many other convincing examples. The story I heard during research is one of people struggling to attract the much-needed external funding amidst a rigidly structured system of choices. The local translation of bureaucratic requirements needs pinpoint precision work from the LAG team, but their work is actually triple-sided, because they also have to be careful not to instill more hopes to their neighbors than the program can deliver while maintaining engagement. Simultaneously, they need to look out for their own institutional survival, which implies a careful pacing of calls for applications in order to justify employment contracts, as well as managing funding gaps, for example, between LEADER iterations. LAG workers are a rare breed in rural spaces, and their presence is acknowledged in rural development policy communities. For example, the county council decided to join all 4 LAGs in its territory and pay membership fees to increase their financial stability. However, the agricultural ministry is focused on control and erratic regulation instead of guidance and predictability, which is not necessarily an issue that stems from the ministry itself, but also another huge issue related to how policies default from Brussels all the way down to Băiaș-Prie. Now, overall, this program is riddled with contradictions originating in its conception. First, its endogenous character evicts the relevance of those external forces that drove the region to marginalization in the first place. Surely, people are fully aware of that. But any external funding coming their way is not to be extensively questioned. For public administrations, which are the main driving force behind this LAG, attracting European funding is a political task from above, as well as a mandate from below. And the funding landscape is not particularly rich. For that matter, comparatively, LEADER is indeed slightly more equitable in terms of spatial justice, but the bar is low. In what regards the prime motivator for participation, the financial payoffs, they are symbolic relative to the required efforts, as well as needs. the LAG's budget is lower than 3 million euros. To quote one example from the field, each of the 17 communes could build just a bridge out of it. Even the RELOCAL budget could have fed 2 moderately sized LAGs. When it comes to actually accessing the funds, the procedural complexity that needs to be navigated feeds the city-based consultancy machine instead of supporting the creation of local human capacity. And we're not even talking about the most marginalized population, but even the mythical rural middle class could not properly access funding without consultancy, extra resources, as well as a myriad of risks. So while local knowledge is taken into account when designing the local development strategy, it is primarily a process of knowing bureaucratically those issues which could potentially be solved through LEADER. There are at least 2 essential requirements for LEADER to succeed: ample funding and a roadmap, and none exist. LEADER starts with the premise that derelict rural areas need a kickstart to figure out on their own what they would like to achieve. This sounds perfectly democratic and encouraging. Yet what would happen, for that matter, what will happen when eventually the program will cease to exist? The rural society envisioned by LEADER, a garden of small blossoming businesses, is unattainable. And if money talks, the rest of the common agricultural policy actively supports large and intensive agricultural enterprises. Not even mentioning the rest of the economical space, which is extremely competitive. And this economical space is amoral in comparison to the highly moral character required by LEADER for LAGs to succeed. The program, which requires the LAGs to have private members as more than half of the total, requires personal sacrifices and idealism while embarking in an unattainable project of turning rural marginalized populations into capitalists living in a communitarian utopia. Participation, a strongly backed attribute of LEADER imbued with palliative effects, does little more than serve to co-opt people in order to increase its funding delivery effectiveness. For this reason, I argue that LEADER is not a rural development tool, but a pedagogical exercise in uneven development. Its role is to bandage the ills produced by decades-long austerity measures and their ensuing widening territorial inequalities while managing rural dissent. Thank you. I will now leave Annika with her part.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Section.
So
Annika?
Yeah, we split the 15 minutes. Do you see probably my presentation? I don't know if it's well seen. Anyway, at the end of these presentations, I propose to you to address the limits and pitfalls of the place-based approach in tackling social injustice. So many positive things have been told about localism, about participatory actions and place-based approach, so that a little bit of criticism would play a role here, I guess. Okay. So in order to speak about this, I made this scheme which wants to reflect on the limitations of the place-based approach, which starts from defining injustice as a spatial matter. Further, it focuses on the local manifestations of injustice, and it generates interventions that aim to unmake injustice locally. But because social injustice has causes rooted in trans-local political economies, one could say that the place-based approach cannot solve injustices locally, and due to how it frames the problem and its solutions, it even may contribute to the reproduction of injustice. So I will put here some arguments from the RELOCAL national reports that I have studied, where there is an agreement on the fact that social injustice is occurring translocally and across nation states.
such as rising unemployment rates, persisting long-term unemployment, weak infrastructure, low incomes, increasing poverty, growing income inequalities, deprived housing and homelessness, shrinking cities, depopulating rural areas are some of the manifestations of this phenomenon, which again is evolving across nation states. Another idea that I could decipher from the RELOCAL national reports was that social injustice has translocal economic and policy causes. And I would like to mention here some of the big economic transformations which changed our societies, at least in the 1970s, which includes deindustrialization, digitalization, and the related disappearance of jobs, globalization and the unregulated movement of capital, interspatial competition at different scales, and competition between cities to attract profit-oriented private investments. And some examples of policy changes that are also with us, at least in the 1970s. Decentralization of public administration, which leaves poor areas and public administrations without developmental resources, entrepreneurial or business-oriented urban governance, magnet cities development model, erosion of social state, the reduction of public spending, austerity measures, and market-oriented housing development. So under these conditions, or faced with these big challenges of our times all over nation states, this is the question that we cannot avoid. Are the local actors and forces possessing the power, the control on decision-making, the financial capacities, the human resources, the institutional abilities to counteract by local actions these political economy processes in a way that would ensure well-being for all in a just manner? My answer is not really. Therefore, as a conclusion, I would like to propose a possible way to continue our research on the local and on special injustice in the European Union. And for this, I also made a brief scheme about how to try to use the political economy approach in addressing spatial injustice, because this approach enables us to address injustice as a spatial matter, but to be aware of the fact that it is not space in itself that creates injustice, but the way how political economy is producing historically the spaces where injustices are manifested. Or in other way said, to address injustice as an endemic feature of capitalist political economy. Related to this, the political economy approach would enable us to address injustice at different scales, and to see the locally manifested forms of injustice as intertwined with transnational injustices. Therefore, I consider that the political economy approach might inspire actions, claims for social and spatial justice that should be framed translocally, and that would be able to address justice making as part of transnational political economy changes. Thank you.
Thank
so how
you
do
very
I,
much. Yeah,
how do I stop it?
just to stop in the top.
Above?
You see
No.
it at the top. Yeah, thank you very much. That was really interesting start into the discussion. I would hand over to Paul Soto to have a little evaluation of what he heard and how this can also be applied on a political level against his background of his work at the European Network for Rural Development. Paul.
Hi, can you hear me?
Say yes, we
Yeah,
hear
you
you
can hear
fine.
me. Good. Thank you for inviting me. I don't know all that many of you. I know some of you though. Michael and Gustav, it's nice to see you. Yeah, as I say, thanks for inviting me. I'm going to give just a few reactions based on the work I've been doing on smart villages on the one hand, and on the long-term vision for rural areas on the other hand. I think you're raising a series of very, very important issues that are particularly important at this moment in time, when everybody is talking about a transition and jumping forward and moving into a new reality. So you talk about both the interplay and the tension between the top down and the bottom up, and there I would just say that I think it's interesting because we had two examples of it. On the one hand, in ECO, I think it was, you were very much saying that inequality is created internationally and by mega trends, if you like, and that we therefore need to intervene at that level. But on the other hand, we had some very strong criticisms of thoughtless and insensitive top-down intervention. So we have that sort of tension between the two. I mean, I completely agree with Eniko that there are a series of mega trends that affect spatial development and spatial inequality. And but it's also true that there is a margin for maneuver for spatial policies to buck the trend, not to change the trend completely. That's very difficult. But certainly to improve outputs and improve outcomes within these macro situations. But it does mean that you need the two. You need the bottom up and you need the top down, and it's the blend that's really important. And there, I would say, my reaction is, I think the messages you are giving about the destruction in many cases that insensitive top-down policies and badly implemented top-down policies are creating at a local level. These are very, very important, but it's more important at this stage to actually say, what are the conditions for sensitive top-down policies at a spatial level? So what do we need? And I think, Michael, you started to talk about those conditions. It's much harder to find good examples of top-down policies that actually enable participative and active local responses. So, and I think we need those examples. There are many in the Nordic countries. There are some in Scotland. There are of good frameworks, and this is really, really important at the moment. So I thought that both the Goth and the Ballotine examples, they're inspiring in a way because they show the potential for mobilizing local communities around unused local assets that hadn't been used in the past. And I experienced that when I was a leader manager in Spain in the 90s, when we hardly had any local products, we hardly had any rural tourism, and there was this it was this combination of some money and policies and the leader principles, and then the fact that the trends were moving in our direction. There was a growing interest in local food. There was a growing interest in rural tourism. So the macro trends and the policies were moving in the same way, and that was a very exciting point. The question is now, after COVID, what? Because to a certain extent, you can go so far with mobilizing cultural heritage, with local food, with local tourism, but what now? So that would be one of my questions. The other question is this issue of the inequality, distributional justice, social justice, or spatial justice, as you called it. It's clear that local development strategies, LEADER and smart villages are particularly good at improving the situation between deprived areas and richer areas. So that the inequality between areas, they're not so good at improving the inequality within, or the spatial justice within areas. And that's why I thought the Palatine example was very interesting, because that is a real balancing act. Because if you're in an area of that kind, you tend to back the winners. You tend to try and support the most creative, entrepreneurial people. You don't start by supporting the people who are furthest from the labour market, who have the biggest difficulties, if you want to pull your whole area up. So there is a tension. Just to finish up, I think all this is particularly important in relation to what is being discussed in this long-term vision for rural areas. We've just come through a whole process of consultations and negotiations. In fact, I'm in the middle of writing up a report on the consultations. One of the big messages coming out is that we have to change the narrative about rural, from rural being victims to rural being actors, and from the geography of discontent to the geography of opportunities. Now, and it's shifting the idea away from just looking at the inequality between urban and rural to looking at the contribution that the rural can make to the whole of society, to the well-being of the whole of society. So it's saying that rural areas can play a role in this big transition, in these macro things that we're going through at the moment. Now, in order to do that, and there's a big ask, if you like, to rural communities saying, you can play a role. We want you to play a role. We want to do this with you. But then I go back to the conditions that Michael talked about, because if what the Commission wants, if member states want rural communities to actually contribute more to this global well-being, then these conditions have to be in place even more. And in Smart Villages, we came up with 6 conditions. And I think in the examples, we saw how most of those conditions were not fulfilled in the cases you gave. So we said there has to be sufficient capacity building and strategic animation in the territory. There has to be that group of community leaders. There has to be access to specialized knowledge in all these new fields. We're talking about health, we're talking about education, digitalization, a transformation of our energy systems. This is not something that we're used to dealing with, and it links the local very much to the national. Flexible funding, not just funding for small projects and trying to solve everything with the money you have, but seed money for innovation that prepares the ground for bigger investments. So it's a completely different philosophy to the funding. It's got to be fast, flexible, and deal with risk. Flexible cooperation. Our cooperation is almost impossible to use at the moment. It's complicated to do local development in one place, but if you have to do it between 2 places, it's twice as complicated, and between 3 places, it's 3 times as complicated. So this is the wrong way around. There need to be incentives to make it easier to cooperate. So cooperation, alignment of policies. So LEADER is never enough to deal with all these problems. It's only seed money. It has to be linked to the possibility of other funds, private, public, and all sorts. So alignment. And then the really important thing, which I think Eniko you referred to, is the regulatory background. The regulations have to be there that facilitate. Now, in most cases, none of those things exist. So I think it's really important, if we're going to actually make this long-term vision a reality, then your messages need to come out very, very, very strongly and very quickly, because it's going to happen now. That's enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. George already responded in the chat. Do you want to take over?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out something that I unfortunately didn't have time to include in my presentation. So I mean, it's kind of an obvious information by now. LEADER has been started in Western Europe, and it arrived in Eastern Europe after its experimental phase was already over. So what we have now, what kind of instruments, what kind of concepts, what orders the whole project? It seems, and my informants have been pretty blatant about it. You know, this whole structure feels like we should have been a French village, but we're not. We're just a Romanian village, and we have our own history, which is very, you know all about it. Right? So you can't, it seems like it's the cherry on top, but there's no cake. So what do you do with it? It just breeds more frustration. And I think this is a very important point, because it can lead to a higher degree of Euroscepticism in the area. And in many ways, fortunately, Romania is still a stronghold of pro-European sentiments. But that's not going to last for long. And this whole turning point would have been in the future, would be very, motivated. There's not much happening, and there were a lot of promises on the table. So how do we deal with that?
Don't have it's not something I can answer. I think the point you're making is really, really important, and I think your phrase "that's the cherry on top with no cake" is really a good phrase to use. And I agree, it's extremely risky. I think the whole strategy we have at the moment is risky, because going for the Green New Deal, the Green Deal, and the digital transition, these are very, there's a lot of support in urban areas and in the more developed places. But if they're not done in a way that is inclusive and deals with the sort of spatial justice, social and spatial justice you're talking about, they can create more discontent than that. So it's a very dangerous position. And I recognize that, I mean, Central and Eastern Europe has a particular problem because of a history. It's a bit better in the south, but it's not in the southern countries, but it's not a lot better. And then it gets very good as you go further north and west. So the point is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater as well. You know, so but I take your point. I don't have a solution.
I think Gustav is.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Hi, Paul. It has been a long time. Thanks for the comments. I mean, there are lots of things about the presentation as well, concerning the comments you gave. But actually, what I want to say now is more connected to Georgie. I mean, I'm dealing, in the last few years, I've been working with rural gentrification. And if you look at all the process, what is happening when we talk about it, we
we always have a very urban point of view. We call it desurbanization, and things like this. We never call it ruralization. We look at it from the urban point of view, and the rural gentrification, people moving out. I mean, it's accelerated by the COVID and by lots of other things in Hungary, at least. I mean, it's really a very important trend now, and it causes so many problems which are very visible on the ground, but you will never see it from far away, because what you see is the economy is growing, infrastructure is growing. People have better education and things like this, but you will never see, I mean, this social and spatial differences go onto a much smaller scale. So within one single village, you will have very rich and very educated and very poor people, and it will never show even from 10 kilometers away. I mean, you know, and I think for this reason, we need a very, we do need a very different approach for analysis, or even trying to understand what is happening. And it is, and it has very important long-term consequences, because I mean, people are pushed out, like poor people are pushed out of the real estate market. They sell their houses, they go away, and old ways of life and culture are just disappearing. And we're gonna have, at least in some parts of Hungary, we are going to have like holiday villages with no real life in them. Or actually, there is a life, but it's a very different one, and it is something that can be very harmful for many different things. That's it.
Thank you, Gustav. Let's collect one remark before maybe Paul can respond to from Michael, because he already raised this out.
Yes, thank you. I think there's lots of very interesting things coming out from this discussion and in the case studies, which are all fantastic. I think I'm struck by it reinforces this point that if the mechanisms like LEADER are too instrumental, they're too regulated and too focused on specific goals, if they're not seen by those people in the communities to be seen to be benefiting them or responding to them, that creates this gap of spatial justice. And I think that was allows us to think about this. And I think there's two very quick comments there. And I think one of them, I think, is the way in which LEADER has changed. And George's comments just then were very interesting in this respect, that very early LEADER was really radical and innovative and very much locally driven. And in a sense, LEADER's become a victim of its success because it's become something which has been mainstreamed and rolled out everywhere, mandatory in RDPs. And with that has gone more and more disciplining of it and regulation of it and standardization, which has lost some of that agility and those innovative elements. And I think the ways in which that can be done, and I think there's very interesting things happening with the Smart Villages program, which has a lot more of that agility in there, and in many instances, we're moving to a new phase. So I think that's important in terms of regulation. But I'm also very struck by Nico's conclusions around the need to think about translocality here, and it comes back to this central point about when we talk about place-based development, we can't just see those places as isolated territories and things. Those places are relational places linked into all kinds of global linkages, and we shouldn't be fatalistic in thinking we can't respond to the impacts of globalization. Local agency can make a difference, but we need to understand what is it that allows local agency to be effective in those bigger contexts. And some of that, I think, is about having the discretion to do things in different ways in different places, and one size does not fit all, and respond to that. But part of it is about the translocality, of recognising the interconnections, of recognising those resources, and the migrants you just mentioned actually are potential resources for those communities as well as challenges. And it's maybe needs thinking about forms of translocal social mobilisation activity which goes beyond rural development, and perhaps we're too fixated in looking at rural development itself rather than social action at times in terms of addressing some of these problems. And it finally comes back to the central point of balancing the bottom and the top down, that giving autonomy is good so long it doesn't become you're dumping all the responsibility on local communities without giving them the powers to act. And actually there's still a responsibility for national and regional and European governments to address some of those fundamental structural issues if you want to have true spatial justice in terms of a fair distribution of resources, as well as a fair distribution of power. And it's getting that balance right, which is a challenge.
Thank you, Mark. Because we are running out of time, I would suggest Paul has the possibility to respond.
I think Michael summed it up very, very well there. I mean, what I would say is, I think the risk we have at the moment, apart from this thing of the cherry with no cake, is that there is a trend now to a decentralization to the national level, so certainly in the rural, in the new CAP strategic plans, everything is going to be very much more. There's much more freedom at national level, the risk is then that the problems you mentioned in Romania get worse, and so the spatial injustice actually across countries at least grows. And I think that's a very important message, because it's the Commission, I think, is saying there is no way we can enforce these very detailed eligibility conditions, and it would be wrong to try to enforce these detailed eligibility conditions everywhere in every small place. But the framework has to be there to enable, and there has to be a framework that allows, that gets the worst of what you're saying in Romania out of the way, or helps you move in the right direction. At the moment, I'm afraid there's going to be an abnegation of responsibility. So there'll be some very, as there usually is, there are some very nice objectives, and I think, but there are no mechanisms to incentivate or to encourage and to penalise the people who don't put in place certain things. So the sorts of things you're talking about in Romania just should not happen, really. And it might be better if you don't have local development, if those sorts of things happen. I mean, that's a big question. But so I'm just saying that I think there has to be, and it's quite important that projects like this actually come out with recommendations about the kind of framework that is needed at a transnational level to help local areas to respond in the way some of the examples gave. So yeah, that's all from me.
Thank you, Paul. So we have new tasks, but we are running out of project time. Yeah, so we need to find funding too. But yes, thank you. We, of course, we could not discuss everything in detail, and we had so many issues now it would be becoming interesting. But in this format, we are not able to discuss everything. So let's hope that we have the possibility to meet again in this frame too. But nevertheless, I really thank everybody for participating in this interesting exchange. And yes, I also think the WebEx board here that partially it worked, so you never know. You always have to be grateful. Yes, so I have everybody a good afternoon, and I will send you the link to the video as soon as it's ready.
Thank you.
Thank you. Organizing this event. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
No, how do I do
Thank
this?
you.
Waiting for the lesson. Okay.